Chapter 12, Lord of the Flies. Page 169. Cry of the Hunters. Ralph lay in a covert, wondering about his wounds. The bruised flesh was inches in diameter over his right ribs, with a swollen and bloody scar where the spear had hit him. His hair was full of dirt and tapped like the tendrils of a creeper. All over he was scratched and bruised from his flight through the forest. By the time his breathing was normal again, he had worked out that bathing these injuries would have to wait. How could you listen for naked feet if you were splashing in water? How could you be safe by the little stream or on the open beach? Ralph listened. He was not really far from the castle rock, and during the first panic he had thought he heard sounds of pursuit, but the hunters had only sneaked into the fringes of the greenery, retrieving spears perhaps, and then had rushed back to the sunny rock as if terrified of the darkness under the leaves. He had even glimpsed one of them striped brown, black, and red, and had judged that it was Bill, but really thought Ralph, this was not Bill. This was a savage whose image refused to blend with that ancient picture of a boy in shorts and shirt. The afternoon died away. The circular spots of sunlight moved steadily over green fronds and brown fiber, but no sound came from behind the rock. At last Ralph wormed out of the ferns and sneaked forward to the edge of that impenetrable thicket that fronted the neck of the island. He peered with elaborate caution between branches at the edge and could see Robert sitting on guard at the top of the cliff. He held a spear in his left hand and was tossing a pebble and catching it again with the right. Behind him, a column of smoke rose thickly so that Ralph's nostrils flared and his mouth dribbled. He wiped his nose and mouth with the back of his hand, and for the first time since the morning felt hungry. The tribe must be sitting around the gutted pig, watching the fat ooze and burn among the ashes. They would be intent. Another figure, an unrecognizable one, appeared by Robert and gave him something, then turned and went back behind the rock. Robert laid his spear on the rock beside him and began to gnaw between his raised hands. So the feast was beginning, and the watchman had been given his portion. Ralph saw that for the time being he was safe. He limped away through the fruit trees, drawn by the thought of the poor food, yet bitter when he remembered the feast. Feast today, and then tomorrow? He agreed unconvincingly that they would let him alone, perhaps even make an outlaw of him. But then the fatal, unreasoning knowledge came to him again. The breaking of the conch and the deaths of Piggy and Simon lay over the island like a vapor. These painted savages would go further and further. Then there was that indefinable connection between himself and Jack, who therefore would never let him alone. Never. He paused, sun-flecked, holding up a bow, prepared to duck under it. A spasm of terror set him shaking, and he cried aloud, "No, they're not as bad as that. It was an accident." He ducked under the bow, ran clumsily, then stopped and listened. He came to the smashed acres of fruit and ate greedily. He saw two lidlins, and not having any idea of his own appearance, wondered why they screamed and ran. When he had eaten, he went toward the beach. The sunlight was slanting now into the palms by the wrecked shelter. There was the platform and the pool. The best thing to do was to ignore this leaden feeling about the heart and rely on their common sense, their daylight sanity. Now that the tribe had eaten, the thing to do was to try again. And anyway, he couldn't stay here all night, in an empty shelter, by the deserted platform. His flesh crept and he shivered. In the evening sun, no fire, no smoke, no rescue. He turned and limped away through the forest toward Jack's end of the island. The slanting sticks of sunlight were lost among the branches. At length he came to a clearing in the forest where rock prevented vegetation from growing. Now it was a pool of shadows, and Ralph nearly flung himself between a tree when he saw something standing in the center. But then he saw that the white face was bone, and that the pig skull grinned at him from top of a stick. He walked slowly into the middle of the clearing and looked steadily at the skull. It gleamed as white as ever, the conch had done, and seemed to jeer at him cynically. An inquisitive ant was busy in one of the eye sockets, but otherwise the thing was lifeless. Or was it? Little prickles of sensation ran up and down his back. He stood, the skull about on a level with his face, and held up his hair with 2 hands. The teeth grinned. The empty sockets seemed to hold his gaze masterfully and without effort. What was it? The skull regarded Ralph like one who knows all the answers and won't tell. A sick fear and rage swept him. Fiercely, he hit out at the filthy thing in front of him that bobbled like a toy and came back, still grinning into his face, so that he lashed and cried out in loathing. Then he was licking his bruised knuckles and looking at the bare stick while the skull lay in 2 pieces, its grin now 6 feet across. He wrenched the quivering stick from the crack and held it as a spear between him and the white pieces. Then he backed away, keeping his face to the skull that lay grinning at the sky. Gross. So now he has an encounter with the head, with the Lord of the Flies, just like Simon did. Remember Simon had that conversation with the thing? Ralph doesn't know anything about that. When the green glow had gone from the horizon and night was fully accomplished, Ralph came again to the thicket in front of the castle rock. Peeping through, he could see that the height was still occupied, and whoever it was up there had a spear at the ready. He knelt among the shadows and felt his isolation bitterly. They were savages, it was true, but they were human, and the ambushing fears of the deep night were coming on. Ralph moaned faintly. Tired though he was, he could not relax and fall into a well of sleep for fear of the tribe. Might it not be possible to walk boldly into the fort, say, "I've got packs," laugh lightly, and sleep among the others, pretend they were still boys, schoolboys who had said, "Sir, yes, sir," and worn caps? Daylight might have answered yes, but darkness and the horrors of death said no. Lying there in the darkness, he knew he was an outcast. Man, don't I know what it feels like to have that feeling of I'm an outcast. Horrible feeling. 'Cause I had some sense. He rubbed his cheek along his forearm, smelling the acrid scent of salt and sweat and the staleness of dirt. Over to the left, the waves of ocean were breathing, sucking down and boiling back over the rock. There were sounds coming from behind the castle rock. Listening carefully, detaching his mind from the swing of the sea, Ralph could make out a familiar rhythm. Kill the beast, cut his throat, spill his blood. The tribe was dancing. Somewhere on the other side of the rocky wall, there would be a dark circle of glowing fire and meat. They would be savoring food from the comfort of society. A noise near at hand made him quiver. Savages were clambering up the castle rock. Right on top, he could hear voices. He sneaked forward a few yards and saw the shape at the top of the rock change and enlarge. There were only 2 boys on the island who moved or talked like that. Ralph put his head down on his forearms and accepted the new fact like a wound. Sam and Eric were part of the tribe now. They were guarding the castle rock against him. There was no chance of rescuing them and building up an outlaw tribe at the other end of the island. Sam and Eric were savages like the rest. Oh. Gosh darn it. Piggy was dead, and the conch smashed to powder. At length the guard climbed down. The 2 that remained seemed nothing more than a dark extension of the rock. A star appeared behind them and was momentarily eclipsed by some movement. Ralph edged forward, feeling his way over the uneven surface as though he were blind. There were miles of vague water at his right, and a restless ocean lay under his left hand, as awful as the shaft of a pit. Every minute the water breathed around the death rock and flowered into a field of whiteness. Ralph crawled until he found the ledge of the entry in his grasp. The lookouts were immediately above him, and he could see the end of a spear projecting over the rock. He called very gently, "Sam and Eric!" There was no reply. To Carrie, he must speak louder, and this would raise those striped and inimical creatures from their feasting by the fire. He set his teeth and started to climb, finding the holds by touch. The stick that had supported a skull hampered him, but he would not be parted from his only weapon. He was nearly level with the twins before he spoke again. "Sam and Eric!" He heard a cry and a flurry from the rock. The twins had grabbed each other and were gibbering. "It's me, Ralph! Terrified that they would run and give the alarm, he hauled himself up until his head and shoulders stuck over the top. Far below his armpit, he saw the luminous flowering rock round the rock. So the death rock is what killed Piggy and smashed the conch. It's down on the beach now. The waves are coming in and circling around it and then going back, and it's leaving like foamy stuff, and he's calling it flowery. At length, they bent forward and peered in his face. Oh, it's only me, Ralph. At length, they bent forward and peered in his face. We thought it was. We didn't know what it was. We thought. Memory of their new and shameful loyalty came to them. Eric was silent, but Sam tried to do his duty. You gotta go, Ralph. You go away now. He wagged his spear and essayed fierceness. You shove off, see? Eric nodded agreement and jabbed his spear in the air. Ralph leaned on his arms and did not go. I came to see you two. His voice was thick. His throat was hurting him now, though it had received no wound. I came to see you two. Words could not express the dull pain of these things. He fell silent, while the vivid stars were split and danced all ways. Sam shifted uneasily. Honest, Ralph, you'd better go. Ralph looked up again. You two aren't painted. How can you... If it were light, shame would burn them at admitting these things. Oh, if it were light, shame would burn them at admitting these things. But the night was dark. Eric took up, and then the twins started their antiphonal speech. You gotta go because it's not safe. They made us. They hurt us. Who, Jack? Oh, no. They bent to him and lowered their voices. Push off, Ralph. It's a tribe. They made us. We couldn't help it. That's what happens when you get beat into a gang. You're getting made. Or however the gang does it, that's what it's called. When Ralph spoke again, his voice was low and seemed breathless. What have I done? I liked him, and I wanted us to be rescued. Again, the stars spilled about the sky. Eric shook his head earnestly. Listen, Ralph, never mind what's sense. That's gone. Never mind about the chief. You gotta go for your own good. The chief and Roger. Yeah, Roger. They hate you, Ralph. They're going to do you. They're going to hunt you tomorrow. But why? I don't know. And Ralph, Jack, the chief, says it'll be dangerous. And we've got to be careful and throw our spears like at a pig. We're going to spread out in a line across the island. We're going forward from this end until we find you. We've got to give signals like this. Eric raised his head and achieved a faint ululation by beating on his open mouth. Then he glanced behind him nervously. So ululate is like la 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 or la 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 la. Kind of like war cries that Native Americans are stereotypically assigned with. And I didn't put my finger in the spot. Oh, then he glanced behind him nervously. Like that. Only louder, of course. But I've done nothing, whispered Ralph urgently. I only wanted to keep up a fire. He paused for a moment, thinking miserably of the morrow. A matter of overwhelming importance occurred to him. What are you? He could not bring himself to be specific at first, but then fear and loneliness goaded him. When they find me, what are they going to do? The twins were silent. Beneath him, the death rock flowered again. What are they? Oh, God, I'm hungry. The towering rock seemed to sway under him. Well, what? The twins answered his question indirectly. You got to go now, Ralph, for your own good. Keep away as far as you can. Won't you come with me? 3 of us. We'd stand a chance. After a moment's silence, Sam spoke in a strangled voice. You don't know Roger. He's a terror. And the chief? They're both terrors. Only Roger... Both boys froze. Someone was climbing toward them from the tribe. He's coming to see if we're keeping watch. Quick, Ralph! As he prepared to let himself down the cliff, Ralph snatched at the last possible advantage to be wrung out of this meeting. I'll lie up close in that thicket down there, he whispered. So keep them away from it. They'll never think to look so close. The footsteps were still some distance away. Sam, I'm going to be all right, aren't I? Twins were silent again. Here, said Sam suddenly, take this. Ralph felt a chunk of meat pushed against him and grabbed it. But what are you going to do when you catch me? Silence above. He sounded silly to himself. He lowered himself down the rock. What are you going to do? From the top of the towering rock came the incomprehensible reply, "Roger sharpened a stick at both ends." Roger sharpened a stick at both ends. Ralph tried to attach a meaning to this, but could not. He used all the bad words he could think of in a fit of temper that passed into yawning. How long could you go without sleep? He yearned for a bed and sheets, but the only whiteness here was the slow spilt milk, luminous around the rock 40 feet below, where Piggy had fallen. Piggy was everywhere, was on this neck, was become terrible in darkness and death. If Piggy were to come back now out of the water with his empty head, Ralph whimpered and yawned like a littlin. The stick in his hand became a crutch on which he reeled. Then his empty head, yikes. Then he tensed again. There were voices raised on the top of the castle rock. Sam and Eric were arguing with someone, but the ferns and the green and the grass were near. That was the place to be in, hidden, and next to the thicket that would serve for tomorrow's hideout. Here, and his hands touched grass, was a place to be in for the night, not far from the tribe, so that if the horrors of the supernatural emerged, one could at least mix with humans for the time being, even if it meant... What did it mean? A stick sharpened at both ends. What was there in that? They had thrown spears and missed, all but one. Perhaps they would miss next time, too. He squatted down in the tall grass, remembered the meat that Sam had given him, and began to tear into it ravenously. While he was eating, he heard fresh noises, cries of pain from Sam and Eric, cries of panic, angry voices. What did it mean? Someone besides himself was in trouble, for at least one of the twins was catching it. Then the voices passed away down the rock, and he ceased to think of them. He felt with his hands and found cool, delicate fronds backed against the thicket. Here, then, was the knight's lair. At first light, he would creep into the thicket, squeeze between the twisted ferns, and ensconce himself so deep that only a crawler like himself could come through, and that crawler would be Jab. There he would sit, and the search would pass him by, and the cordon waver on, ululating along the island, and he would be free. So, la! He pulled himself between the ferns, tunneling in. He laid the stick beside him and huddled himself down in the blackness. One must remember to wake at first light in order to diddle the savages. And he did not know how quickly sleep came and hurled him down a dark interior slope. He was awake before his eyes were open, listening to a noise that was near. He opened an eye, found the mold an inch or so from his face, and his fingers gripped into it, light filtering between the fronds of fern. He had just time to realize that the age-long nightmares of falling and death were past, and that the morning was come, when he heard the sound again. It was an ululation over by the seashore, and now the next savage answered, and the next. The cry swept by him across the narrow end of the island from sea to lagoon, like the cry of a flying bird. He took no time to consider, but grabbed his sharp stick and wriggled back among the ferns. Within seconds, he was worming his way into the thicket, but not before he had glimpsed the legs of a savage coming toward him. The ferns were thumped and beaten, and he heard legs moving in the long grass. The savage, whoever he was, ululated twice, and the cry was repeated in both directions, then died away. Ralph crouched still, tangled in the ferns, and for a time he heard nothing. At last, he examined the thicket itself. Certainly no one could attack him here, and moreover, he had a stroke of luck. The great rock that had killed Piggy had bounded into the thicket and bounced there, right in the center, making a smashed space a few feet in extent each way. When Ralph had wriggled into this, he felt secure and clever. He sat down carefully among the smashed stems and waited for the hunt to pass. Looking up between the leaves, he caught a glimpse of something red. That must be the top of Castle Rock, distant and unmenacing. He composed himself triumphantly to hear the sounds of the hunt dying away. Yet no one made a sound, and as the minutes passed in the green shade, his feeling of triumph faded. At last he heard a voice, Jack's voice, but hushed. "Are you certain?" Savage address said nothing. Perhaps he made a gesture. Roger spoke. "If you're fooling us..." Immediately after this, there came a gasp and a squeal of pain. Ralph crouched instinctively. One of the twins was there, outside the thicket, with Jack and Roger. "You're sure he meant in there?" The twin moaned faintly and then squealed again. He meant he'd hide in there. Yeah, oh. Silvery laughter scattered among the trees, so they knew. Ralph picked up his stick and prepared for battle. But what could they do? It would take them a week to break a path through the thicket, and anyone who wormed his way in would be helpless. He felt the point of his spear with his thumb and grinned without amusement. Whoever tried that would be stuck, squealing like a pig. They were going away, back to the tower rock. He could hear feet moving, and then someone sniggered. There came again that high, bird-like cry that swept along the line, so some were still watching for him. But there was a long, breathless silence. Ralph found that he had bark in his mouth from the gnawed spear. He stood and peered upwards to the castle rock. As he did so, he heard Jack's voice from the top. Heave! 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 The red rock that he could see at the top of the cliff vanished like a curtain, and he could see figures in blue sky. A moment later, the earth jolted, and there was a rushing sound in the air, and the top of the thicket was cupped as with a gigantic hand. The rock bounded on, thumping and smashing toward the beach, while the shower of broken twigs and leaves fell on him. Beyond the thicket, the tribe was cheering. Silence again. Ralph put his fingers in his mouth and bit them. There was only one other rock up there that they might conceivably move, but that was half as big as a cottage, big as a car, a tank. He visualized its probable progress with agonizing clearness. That one would start slowly, drop from the ledge to ledge, trundle across the neck like an outsized steamroller. Heave! Heave! Ralph put down his spear, then picked it up again. He pushed his hair back irritably, took 2 hasty steps across the little space, and then came back. He stood looking at the broken ends of branches. Still silence. He caught sight of the rise and fall of his diaphragm and was surprised to see how quickly he was breathing. Just left of center, his heartbeats were visible. He put the spear down again. Heave! Heave! A shrill, prolonged cheer. Something boomed up on the red rock. Then the earth jumped and began to shake steadily, while the noise as steadily increased. Ralph was shot into the air, thrown down, dashed against branches. At his right hand and only a few feet away, the whole thicket bent and roots screamed as they came out of the earth together. He saw something red that turned over slowly as a mill wheel. Then the red thing was past, and the elephantine progress diminished toward the sea. Ralph knelt on the plowed-up soil and waited for the earth to come back. Presently, the white broken stumps, the split sticks, and the tangle of the thicket refocused. There was a kind of heavy feeling in his body where he had watched his own pulse. Silence again, yet not entirely so. They were whispering out there, and suddenly the branches were shaken furiously at 2 places on his right. The pointed end of a stick appeared. In panic, Ralph thrust his own stick through the crack and struck with all his might. Aye! His spear twisted a little in his hands, and then he withdrew it again. Oh, oh! Someone was moaning outside, and a babble of voices rose. A fierce argument was going on, and the wounded savage kept groaning. Then, when there was silence, a single voice spoke, and Ralph decided that it was not Jack's. See? I told you, he's dangerous! The wounded savage moaned again. What else? What next? Ralph fastened his hands around the chewed spear, and his hair fell. Someone was muttering only a few yards away toward the castle rock. He heard a savage say, "No!" in a shocked voice, and then there was a suppressed laughter. He squatted back on his heels and showed his teeth at the wall of branches. He raised his spear, snarled a little, and waited.